Hey everyone, and welcome to our second lecture of the second week of technical writing. We are going to cover audience analysis and tailoring a message in this lecture. I'm really going to give you just kind of two simple ways of analyzing an audience and one slide on tailoring a message. So we're not going to go too in depth, but it's all vocab, like I mentioned in the first video, that I'm going to ask you to use in your discussions and for your one assignment this week. The first thing I always want to talk about and always want to cover when it comes to thinking about audience and thinking about how a message is going to be maybe altered or tailored is to think about what's called a rhetorical situation. If you took English 110, you likely heard about this before, but I just wanted to go over it one more way for you. This comes more from business writing than from rhetoric, but here's how one business writing textbook describes it, and I'll cite it in the video description below. But the rhetorical situation is divided into 8 parts. I like to think of this top row here as the kind of primary parts of the rhetorical situation, and then this bottom part is kind of the secondary aspects of the rhetorical situation. So with any piece of writing, any piece of communication, whether it's technical or not, you're always going to have a source. And so if we're thinking about this video, for instance, we can't think about the source as myself sitting here talking, delivering the message. But like I said, some of this information comes from books I've read or my own educational background. And so the source can be kind of deeper than just the person speaking as well. It can come from experience. It can come from research. There's always those kinds of ideas underlying the source of a message. The second part of the rhetorical situation is the message itself, always divided into 2 parts. The first part of the message are the actual words being used, what you're hearing me say right now, for example. And then the second part of the message is what is meant by those words, or what's kind of the underlying meaning. And so in this case, the underlying meaning might be something like, the instructor really wants us to be good technical writers, so he's giving us all these words, all these different ways of thinking about writing. The channel, also sometimes called the medium, but in this case, we can think about YouTube as our medium, or I'm using Zoom to record this. And these will always have some kind of effect on the message itself, right? So, for example, in my usual classroom, I think I much prefer to use the whiteboard and to brainstorm a lot with students as far as what we mean by different words. But because we're doing the asynchronous class and these are the media that I'm using, we do more of like a PowerPoint and a just me talking kind of thing. So of course, those are going to affect your message. And then lastly, always your receiver. And that's what we're going to get into in a second, thinking about audience. You can't assume in technical writing that you'll ever have one type of user. The research that's out there kind of refers to this as thinking about someone as impossibly universalized. And so in technical writing, we never want to think that there's just one type of person who's going to be reading our message. We have to be writing for all the different kinds of audiences that might be encountering our message. Here are the secondary parts of the rhetorical situation. I'll try to go through them pretty quickly. Feedback. In academia, we always think about the feedback our professors give us on our paper. But in technical writing, you can think about the types of feedback your actual users give you, whether you try to write a new recipe or try to write a new book of instructions and people get back to you and say, hey, I just can't get this to work. Maybe you can tailor the language. So that's feedback. I think someone did mention on the discussion post the idea of a Google review or a Yelp review being a piece of technical communication. And in this case, you might think about it as feedback, right? If you publish something online and you get a Google review that says, hey, I can't figure this out, that becomes part of the rhetorical situation. Environment, this typically means like the concrete environment. And so if you are writing a piece of technical instructions, for example, you want to think about the actual environment that somebody might be in. So if we go back to our board game instructions, we want to think about what someone's living room might look like, or what their gaming room might look like, in order to better tailor our instructions. Context is kind of the abstract side of that. And so in environment, we're thinking about, physical tables, physical chairs, physical space. In context, you're thinking a little bit more abstract. What might your receiver's previous knowledge be? What cultural background are they from? What are their histories and things like that? How might that affect your message? And then interference. We know that all too well these days in the 21st century. There is always a ton of messages going on, a ton of information out there. And so you want to be thinking about what makes your message really important and what makes your piece of writing the thing that people should be focusing on in a given moment. And so there's a big kind of broad definition of the rhetorical situation for you. This comes from another business writing textbook by Quintanilla and Wahl. They give us this tool for professional excellence. It's number 12.1 in their textbook. Again, I'll put the citation for that book below. But here's what they give us as far as audience analysis goes. And so we're zooming in on this part of the rhetorical situation right now, our receivers. I saw some people took courses before this on business communication, especially presentations. And so that's what they're dealing with, actually. They're thinking about when you're about to give a big oral presentation, what kinds of things should you be thinking about in the audience? But I'm going to say you should be thinking about this with all of your writing in general. So first, they give us some demographic questions. They say, what is the general demographic information for this audience? Are they mostly young people? Are they mostly old people? Are they mostly Americans? Are they mostly international students, for example, and from which areas? All of these things would matter when you're thinking about the demographics and who will be reading your writing. This is the question I want to zoom in on. What is the audience's level of knowledge concerning this topic? This gets into the definitions from your textbook and also from our friends Lannan and Gurak, who I keep bringing up, but I'll get to those on the next slide. Other things you might consider when you're thinking about your receiver is your relationship to the audience. Do they know you? Are you a stranger to them? How does that alter the amount of trust they might have? And then what is the audience's members' relationship with one another? So is this a group of strangers or is this a group of people who have been working together before? All just things to think about as far as analyzing your audience goes. But let's get into what we mean by types of audience in technical writing. So from your textbook, the one by Allison Gross and her colleagues, they break it down into 4 categories, which I think are good for thinking about business or workplace technical writing. But they say there's experts who know the business or organization inside and out. There are technicians. These are the people who build, operate, maintain, and repair the items that the experts design and theorize about. And so where experts might write manuals, the technicians have to look at the manual and make sure they can actually design the thing that's being talked about and turn it into a real physical, actionable kind of object or item. Executives are your decision makers, and so where technicians need to know exactly how to build, operate, and maintain things, sometimes executives need different types of information, such as the profitability of an object or how cutting edge it is, and so that might require a different kind of communication from an expert to a technician in the sense that the executive might not have to know everything inside and out. They just need to know what choices can be made given the information. And then there's your non-specialists. They say these are your secondary audiences. So anytime a business publishes a white paper or something like that, where hobbyists might just want to read it and they have no real effect on the situation, they say those are non-specialists. So again, I think that's really good for thinking about the business place because it lays out the tiers that you'll find in those areas. Lannan and Gurak, the other textbook that I've mentioned a few times now, they give you 3 different ways of thinking about it. They say there's 3 audiences. There's technical audiences, there's semi-technical audiences, and there's non-technical audiences. I like this a little bit better because it's a little bit more broad. Technical, as we learned last week, can mean a lot of different things. To be technically sound in something doesn't mean you're a research expert or that you know kind of everything inside and out. It can just mean that you have a very particular and specialized type of knowledge. So if we think about the hockey play that I showed in, I think the first or second lecture last week, we found out that that has a lot of technical language in and of itself. And so people can be technical in a lot of different ways and not necessarily experts of something or knowing organizations all that well. And then there's semi-technical, which again, that would be like people who understand hockey enough maybe to have understood what was going on in that video, but maybe they couldn't go and execute it themselves. And then non-technical audiences like, hey, could that video have been made for people who don't know the rules of this sport at all? If I go back and watch that one, I don't think someone who didn't know anything about hockey could figure it out. So we'd say that's a non-technical audience. So the reason I get back to that, and I say I like that better, is because we're all kind of all of these audiences in different types of ways, right? Like I am a technical audience when it comes to technical communication, but if I wanted to learn about some of your majors like wildlife ecology, I would be a total non-technical audience, and I would need some of the more simple terms in order to understand it. And then there's any number of things where we could be semi-technical, where maybe we know enough where we could pick up what people are saying, but not really fully be able to describe it. And so in your discussion, I'm going to ask you to do a self-profile where maybe you think about where you would be these different kinds of audiences and thinking about describing what knowledge you have to somebody else. And so keep those in mind, but I really like those for thinking about the audience outside of the workplace, which this is more geared towards. So with all that in mind, here are some ways to think about tailoring a piece of technical writing. I'm going to ask you to do this for your assignment this week, and then also describe it in your discussion. So these are just some examples. You can kind of go and do what you want as well. But sometimes you have to add information in a piece of technical writing, particularly if you have an expert or technical audience who might be looking for more information in a research paper or maybe in a proposal. You have to go in and add more info. And then again, if you're thinking about a semi-technical or non-technical audience, maybe it's a good idea to go in and take things out. Maybe they don't need to know every single little thing, but just need to be able to understand the basics. Further research is always good. We'll have a lecture at the end of this week. That'll be the next lecture to think about how technical writers do research. You can always change examples, change metaphors. I particularly like this. My research is all about thinking about how and why metaphors work. For example, some people call the syllabus a contract as a metaphor, and I'm always working on changing that because I don't think it's one that particularly works. In the last lecture, we talked about the organization of a document, sometimes called the information architecture if you're thinking about a web page. But sometimes if you're dealing with a non-technical audience, you want to put that really basic stuff up front, and then get into the more technical stuff later on. So that's something to think about, providing summaries up front instead of expecting people to read every single word. Maybe you can give an abstract. Changing sentence lengths. We know sentence length has a lot to do with reading level, and so shorter sentences typically correspond to a lower reading level, and longer sentences to a higher reading level. And so sometimes just shortening your sentence length can make your writing more available to more audiences. And then, of course, lastly here, add or subtract graphics. We saw some good ones and some less good ones in the last lecture, but always something to think about. And then, of course, lastly, redesigning the document generally. So we talked about that grid layout and some of the headings and things like that in the last lecture, but sometimes how we modify those can appeal to different levels of audiences. And so again, just some ideas to think about. I'm going to ask you to practice with them, but these, of course, aren't the only ways of tailoring a piece of technical writing. So you can always think about this yourself as well. So that's all I got for this lecture. I'll record one more for this week, and I'll look forward again to participating in the discussions and seeing what you all come up with for the assignment. Thanks.